Welcome to another of the series of the consultation processes organised by ourselves, Irish Rural Link and EirGrid, looking at the future of electricity. We have many challenges facing us over the coming years. Climate change, will we have the right type of electricity? Will we be able to make the changes and bring a more green industry into our country? Those are the challenges, and of course, will we have jobs as a result of it? Tonight we have a very excellent panel, but before I introduce them, I'm going to simply say to you, the public who have joined and members of Irish Rural Link, if you've used Zoom before, you will know there's a chat box at the very bottom. If you put your cursor on the bottom of the screen, and you'll see by that chat box, you simply press that button and type in on the side any questions or any observations or comments you may wish to add during the process. Sometimes the guests could even answer those questions as you write them, so that would be a great bonus. There will be workshops based afterwards. Really all you do is follow James's instructions, don't do anything, and you will almost certainly get a chance to get your own voice raised, hopefully not in anger, but in questioning and challenging. So with that, I'm going to start by handing over to my colleague, James Claffey. By the way, my name is Seamus Boland of Irish Rural Link. James works with Irish Rural Link, and James is going to get you to do a small little bit of work and get the ball rolling. So James, I hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Seamus, and welcome everyone this evening. As Seamus said, our purpose this evening is to get people's views on Ireland's electricity future. And I suppose to start the process this evening, we are just looking to get people thinking and get their activities moving. So just give me 2 seconds while I get our technology up and working. This evening, so we're just going to ask people to go to Slido as I get up the screen here now. So if I could ask people please to go to slido.com, and when you get to Slido, you just enter the code that appears on your screen there at the moment, and the code for those is 484272. So just go to Slido and enter that code. So I suppose, as I said, we just want to get people thinking this evening, and before we actually start the presentations and discussion, and there's a question that will appear on your screen. Ireland should do everything possible so that by 2030, at least 70% of its electricity comes from renewable sources like wind or solar. Would you agree with this statement? So do you agree? Sorry, do you strongly agree, neither disagree, or agree, disagree, or strongly disagree? So Seamus, we'll just leave that there for about 30 seconds and give people the chance to do it. And there's still a few people coming in as well, so we might just leave it there for about 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'm just going to do my own technology and open the chat line as well to see what I'm looking at. Okay, I can see the responses coming in gradually, and I hope you will too. So to get the ball rolling, as I said, the first part of it will be presentations because it's kind of setting the scene. And after that, there will be loads of opportunities for you to either go to the chat line and get your voice or your typing done, but you will also be able to speak in the chat rooms that we will break into 2 or 3, depending on the numbers here tonight. So one thing is certain, you will be heard. So let's start with the panel here tonight. We're starting with Dr. Paul Dean. He's a Senior Research Fellow in Clean Energy Futures at the Environmental Research Institute, the Mare Centre in UCC, University College Cork. He has authored and co-authored over 120 technical papers on the future of energies in such areas as electricity markets, European global power systems, renewable energy integration, and energy access. He was first author on Ireland's low carbon roadmap in 2015. He is an active contributor to the European policy thinking on clean energy, and in 2019 was the Royal Irish Academy Speaker in the Computer Science and Engineering. So Paul, without any further ado, I will give the microphone to you. Before I do, folks, if your microphone is switched on, please switch it off during these presentations and follow it from there. Other than that, the floor and the screen, I should say, Paul, is yours.
Thank you very much, Seamus. Thanks for that lovely introduction. And good evening, everyone. I hope that wherever you are in the country or even outside Ireland, I hope you're all well, and I hope you're all safe this evening. I've just got the kids down to bed, which is great. But if you hear another shout coming in there from the background, that'll be one of them waking up. But don't be too alarmed. My wife is, thankfully, she's on hand to take over if things go awry. But I'll be talking to you this evening about, I suppose, just very simply about why are we talking about renewable electricity? What's all of this about? And maybe putting some context and letting you know what choices we have in Ireland and understanding the motivation for these choices. But just before we start off, let me just talk a bit about where I work and where I come from. It's always important to know. So I work down in University College Cork, and I work with a centre called the MARI Centre. Now, MARI are the Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Science, for Energy, Marine and Climate down in Cork. And we're actually an umbrella group of lots of different universities right across Ireland. And we think about lots of things. We think about clean energy. We think about climate action. My own work specifically, I think about the future of electricity. I think about how we will heat our homes, how we will fuel our cars and use our land, and do all that in a clean way that is sustainable into the future. And we work a lot with the Irish government. We work a lot with industry. We work a lot with different societies, with different community groups, and we do a lot in terms of putting numbers, I suppose, and putting evidence with different choices that we have around different things in Ireland. So we're kind of big picture organization, standing back and looking at things in Ireland, looking at things globally, and understanding what we have to do and why we have to do it. And of course, when we're talking about why we have to do it, you know, we're really talking here about climate change, and climate change is happening now. Many of you are very aware of lots of stories internationally in climate change. We're seeing a lot of climate action around the world at the moment, from President Biden over in the US, and even countries now like Russia and China and India are very much starting to take climate action very serious and making plans to clean up their power grids and clean up their energy systems. That's a really good thing, and it's a really healthy thing. Part of my work, I'm in a very privileged position working as a research scientist. I get time to read a lot of the science on climate action and about climate change. And I suppose one of the things I find most unsettling, if I'm being honest, it's the range of scenarios out into the future. You know, none of them are very good. They all are very bad in many ways. And even though there's a little bit of uncertainty about how extreme weather events will get and how difficult things may be, there's no doubt that it's happening. And unfortunately, we know that it's primarily us as humans who are causing this. And we know as we go out into the future, if we're not able to get our greenhouse gas emissions, which are the gases we release into the atmosphere from heat trapping gases and also coming from things like agriculture and land use, if we're not able to get these under control, we're kind of walking into the unknown, if you will, a world that will be warmer and a world that will certainly be more exposed to more climate extremes. So, but the good news is, you know, even though there is a lot of doom and gloom sometimes in the media about climate action and climate change, but I'm relatively hopeful, because actually we have a lot of the answers, and we know what we have to do. We have some choices that we need to figure out, but I'm very optimistic about the future, because we know what we need to do. And actually, in fact, as we'll see at the end of this presentation, we have a lot of the tools and technologies already available to us. So when we stand back and look at climate change and look at emissions, or these greenhouse gas emissions, these heat trapping gases which are causing our atmosphere to warm, well, where do they come from? We're going to start and stop. We're going to move back from Ireland and look at the global picture first of all. And what we're going to be looking at here is our fossil fuel energy use since the 1950s. So this is at a global level, and there's a lot going on in this graph. But what I want you to do is keep an eye on the top line, and as the graph moves across to the right, that you'll see the fossil fuel, things like coal and oil and gas, increasing. And these are primarily one of the main drivers of climate action from a global perspective. When I show this to our students in UCC, I often ask them just to look down at the bottom and kind of think of the day, or maybe look at the date on the bottom and see how the world has changed, maybe since you were born or since you were married. No, I only have the data here from 1950s. If you were born before that, maybe, you know, look at your wedding day, or your first job, or the birth of your first child, or whatever. But see how the world has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. Now let me run this on here, and as we see, as this graph runs up, look at the oil use. You know, oil use has absolutely exploded since the 1950s by a factor of 4 or 5. Coal use has absolutely ballooned, you know, by almost a factor of 6 since the 1950s. Now, while it's very easy to vilify fossil fuels and say that all this is wrong, but remember, our society has been built, you know, on the developments caused by these fossil fuels. We have a very comfortable life, many of us in Ireland and many of us across the developed world, because of fossil fuels. So there has been good and there has been bad. But this picture needs certainly to change dramatically, because particularly these three fuels, oil, coal, and gas, particularly coal and oil, are the dirtiest of the fossil fuels, are a real big problem when it comes to global emissions. And even if you have really good eyesight now, you can look way down the bottom and you see at a global level, you see the cleaner fuels, even like wind and solar and hydro and a bit of nuclear and bioenergy, and they're really, you know, they're really at such a low level today at a global picture, and we really need to ramp those up very significantly. And even when we think about the future, well, how does this consumption pattern, how does this need to change if we want to avoid the worst elements of climate change? And we can actually roll this picture forward here. We go on to the next slide here, and we see the buildup of fossil fuels again, really dramatic increases since the 1970s, and again since the year 2000. And now if we go on to the future this time, what we have to do is dramatically reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. And we need to dramatically increase the level of clean renewable energy, things like wind and solar, right across the system. And of course, the good news is, yes, at a global level, we know we can do this. We have the technologies and the know-how, but it's certainly not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to be straightforward. And of course, it's not just about climate action, and it's not just about technologies. Right across Ireland, you know, down here in Cork before the lockdown, there used to be, you know, the protests with the Fridays for Futures, school kids, college kids coming out and protesting on the street. So, and we're not just seeing this in Ireland, we're seeing it right across the globe, you know, in the UK, in Europe, in the States, in Canada, South America, that citizens are demanding a cleaner future. We're demanding cleaner air, cleaner water, and a more stable future. So it's not just about technology, wrapped around technology as well. It's very strong community movements and very strong political movements. And again, it's not just all about emissions. If you look at what's happening in the world today, there was a huge leader summit. All the global leaders came together last week. Again, President Biden, Minister Amy Ryan was there as well, talking about the clean energy future. And one of the messages that really comes out of that is it's not just about emissions anymore. It's also about jobs. It's about industry. This is the direction of travel for a lot of major manufacturing, and this is a lot of this is a direction of travel for a lot of big companies. So it's also about jobs, society, and a more sustainable future economically and environmentally, which is an important element there as well. I mentioned Minister Ryan there. In Ireland, we're going through a very important period for climate action at the moment. The government have released this new climate ambition, and it's really quite remarkable in terms of what the government wants to do. You know, in Ireland, we project this image internationally about being a very green country and about being a very sustainable country. But actually, when you scratch at the surface and look at the data, Irish people have the largest greenhouse gas footprint per capita in Europe. Sorry, one of the largest in Europe. So we're not very green at all. And even though it's very easy to complain about China and India and all this, us ourselves as Irish citizens have a massive environmental footprint when it comes to our greenhouse gas emissions. So we do need to get our own house in order here. And what the government plan to do, here's a map, here's a kind of a very simple chart of greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland since the 1990s. And look what happened in the year 2000, between the year 2000 and 2005, you know, the boom times, you know, when the economy was booming here in Ireland, we kind of forgot a lot about sustainability, forgot a lot about environmental issues, and our emissions increased significantly. And of course, it's a very obvious, you know, crash coming from 2008 to 2010. And what the government want to do now, and in essence, what we're doing is kind of making up for lost time, making up for kind of, I suppose, a decade or two of poor performance and climate action. And what the plan is now over the next 10 years is to reduce all our greenhouse gas emissions by a half, which will be a remarkable achievement. And this is why action on electricity and action on clean energy is a fundamental part of that. So it's part of a real big picture about decarbonising Ireland, which fits into this global picture about a real global movement that's happening at the moment around climate action, jobs and sustainability and business. Now, talking about greenhouse gas emissions, this chart is a little bit busy here, but it kind of explains where our greenhouse gas emissions come from in Ireland. Remember, the greenhouse gases are the things that trap the heat in the atmosphere. And in Ireland, we have a large chunk of them, huge chunk of emissions coming from agriculture. But in the energy sector, the big issues are electricity, transport, and heat. And here tonight, we're here talking about electricity. And action on electricity is really fundamentally important because you know, things like EVs and electric cars, all that's very exciting, but, you know, very few people are lucky enough to be able to buy a new car, not to mind a brand new electric car. But when that does come, when the cost of those things come down in the future, and you're looking at to decarbonize those things to make them cleaner, having clean electricity to charge those things or to heat your home will be fundamentally important. And even though electricity, when you think about electricity use in Ireland today, it's probably only about 20% of all our energy use. You know, if you look around your house and most of our appliances are probably electricity, but if you look out into your local community, like trucks and tractors and big factories, don't use electricity at all. But as we decarbonize our economy, electricity will reach deeper into the transport sector and deeper into the heating sectors. And that's why it's really fundamentally important to have clean electricity as part of this foundation that we build this decarbonization vision on. And then, of course, you know, we've many options and many choices. You know, I live down here in West Cork. There's a wind farm over there in Carrickfada. It's about, you know, 15 kilometers away with 17 to 23 turbines on it. You know, Ireland is very strong for onshore renewable wind energy, and as well massive potential that we haven't really tapped into that much in Ireland for offshore as well, for offshore wind energy. And there's other options. You know, in my research center, we're looking at things like producing electricity from wave energy. Still a little bit expensive at the moment. We've a long way to go there yet, but who knows if you could crack that again with a niche, a huge resource. And there's also energy that we don't use by making our homes more energy efficient. Solar panels on our homes, things like low carbon heating resources such as air source heat pumps. And also in Ireland, we have a very active ecosystem. You know, we grow things very well in Ireland, and there's potential for energy crops, sustainable biomass and sustainable bioliquids as well to produce that in Ireland. And that's very exciting as well as a complementary technology to things like renewables and energy efficiency and others. And there's other options as well. A lot of you might have heard about hydrogen, liquid biofuels and liquid transport fuels. All these things are very exciting about the future, but they're actually all fundamentally premised on the availability of clean, renewable and sustainable electricity, which is really, again, that cornerstone of the house that you will build for a zero carbon future. So a question we often get asked in UCC here is, well, why renewable electricity? You know, and it's actually a very simple answer. You know, it's very windy in Ireland. You know, we have lots and lots of wind. Ireland is one of the windiest parts of Europe. You know, we're up there with Scotland. So it's a resource that passes over our heads, passes over our country every single day. We have lots of it. And again, we're actually very, very good at it. You know, this is one of the great success stories I mentioned in Ireland. As citizens, we have one of the largest environmental footprints when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions in Europe. But actually embedded in that, we are hidden behind that story, I suppose. We do have a very successful story about the development of wind energy and renewables in Ireland, growing from a very, very low level. And just last year, I think to 2021 or 2020, about 43%. That's 4 out of every 10 units of electricity in Ireland was generated from clean, renewable electricity from wind that blows across our country. And I think that's a real good story that we have here in Ireland. So simply, why renewable electricity? We have lots of it, and we're actually very good at it. So Seamus, I might hand it back to you there now and pass it back to you for the next speaker.
Thanks very much, Paul, for that. That was a really good presentation. And as I said, don't be shy, get some comments in. One of the reasons when Irish Rural Link was founded in 1991, and I see one of our founders has joined us here this evening, you know, it was all about creating peopled places. And our motto is sustainable rural communities. We also said that there has to be consultation. We cannot do things unless we ask people, because rural communities have been in the past very good at doing their own thing and getting their own organizations, cooperatives, whatever it is going. And one of the things that I welcome about EirGrid as part of this is that EirGrid are now clearly asking everybody through different organizations, not just us, through the youth councils and various other organizations. They're trying to get as many views on board in shaping the electricity of our future. To this end, I'm really pleased to welcome Liam Ryan. He's the Chief Innovation and Planning Officer. Liam has worked and is with EirGrid, obviously. He was executive leading shaping our electricity future program, Prior to this, Liam was an interim director of grid development and interconnection. He's held a number of other positions in EirGrid, including head of integrated single electricity marketing and transition and head of transmission engineering and maintenance. Before joining EirGrid, Liam was a number of senior roles in Hewlett-Packard and other large organizations. A graduate of Trinity College, he's a PhD and Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering, holds a Master's in Mathematics. Liam is very enthusiastic about shaping the electricity of the future. Liam, the screen or the floor is yours.
Seamus, thanks a million, and thanks a million to everybody for giving up their time this evening to give me the opportunity to come and talk to yourself. Just to build on what Paul has actually said, it's a really exciting time to be part of our society. Like, we're going through a massive change in relation to it, and I think we're very fortunate that we actually have a very forward-looking government. That other countries are looking to us now. Like, as Paul said, we're leading on onshore renewable integration. And last year we got 43% of our electricity came from renewable sources, which is a huge, massive achievement. And there's probably only the likes of Denmark who are competing with us on relation to the renewable integration. So what I'm here to talk to you this evening about is kind of going, well, what does this really mean? And so we're trying to actually talk about how we deliver 70% on average of our electricity coming from renewable sources out to 2030. And like, before I get into that, I'm going to say, first of all, who is EirGrid and why are we actually here today to really talk to you? And so EirGrid is owned by the Irish government, and we're a regulated utility, and like, our job is to make sure that the electricity system has enough power to meet the demand actually in the country. And we don't generate electricity, and we make sure that electricity is brought from where it's generated to where it's actually where it's used. And we're also responsible for connecting in with other neighbouring grids to make sure that we can share the power both between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and between Ireland and the UK, and into the future between Ireland and down to France. So we don't own the grid, so we've no vested interest in adding to it. And in essence, really what we're trying to do is make sure that the grid is fit for purpose, to make sure that it delivers for the communities, the business, and the targets that the government want to actually make out to 2030. And as Paul said, to get us to that zero carbon into the future. So how does the grid actually work? Right. So on one side, we actually have the generators. As you can see here on the left-hand side of the graph and of the diagram in front of you. And those companies bid into what's called a wholesale electricity market. And that sets the price that they will actually get paid. And we then dispatch the most cheapest guy actually onto the system. And at the far side, at the right-hand side of that graph, it's every day when we turn on our switches that we actually consume electricity, and we go to suppliers to make sure that that supply is reliable. But things are changing, as Paul actually said earlier. We now actually have the electrification of heat and transport is one of the key targets, and that will take time to roll out. And then we also actually have micro generation rolling out in the future as well, into homes. So how we actually consume and how we generate electricity is changing. And in the middle, you actually have the distribution system, which ESB actually owns and operates. And that brings the power from the transmission grid to your homes and to your businesses. And then you actually have the transmission grid, which really is the motorways, if you like, of the electricity system. And that's really to move the power from where it's been generated to where it's actually being utilized by large energy users or onto the distribution system. And so why is electricity the solution to climate change? And I'm not going to repeat everything that Paul said, but in essence, we're trying to actually, first of all, reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning on the system, which creates the emissions as the generation side. And then at the other side, it's the electrification of heat and transport. And actually tackling both sides of the equation with more renewable types of energy in the system gives us a better chance of ensuring that 70% of electricity comes from renewable sources. And also it protects the environment for future generations, and it minimizes the impact of climate change, which is now recognized around the world, as Paul has actually said. So what does this actually mean from the grid? So the transmission grid is in every county across the country. The grey lines here represent 110. The bluish lines represent the 220 kV voltage, and in the red are the 400. And the 400s are the large, and the 220 are the large kind of motorways and dual carriageways, if you like, for moving power around the country. And historically, when the power system was developed, it was with a consideration that we actually had a small number of large generators located in the likes of Moneypoint, in Dublin, in Cork, and in Great Island as examples, and also in the Midlands. And what we actually have over the last period in time is now we actually have a lot more renewable generation connecting onto the system. So as of last year, we have about 4,500 megawatts of renewable generation connected onto the system. And that's against a peak of about 5,300. So a significant percentage of the fuel mix is coming from renewable sources. And they're generally located around the north, the northwest, the west, and the southwest and the Midlands. And more recently, we see that the introduction of solar coming in, and it's great to see in the last res auction that a high percentage or a good percentage were community-based projects coming into it. But in essence, we're now trying to make sure that we can move that power to where it's being consumed. And we see when we roll out to 2030 that we see the amount of electricity, the demand for it is going to increase by about 50%. So it's going to go from about 30 terawatt hours to between 41 and 45 terawatt hours during that period in time. So to make sure that we hit the government targets, we'll need to put on about 10 gigawatts of additional renewable energy onto the power system between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And therefore we'll need to make sure that the grid is fit for purpose to make sure that actually happens in the most effective way that it possibly can. So as I said, to achieve this, we need to make sure that we modernize the grid to make sure it's strong and flexible to deliver what we actually need. And to that end, EirGrid are going to be making sure that we maximize the utilization of that grid as much as we possibly can, and therefore minimize the amount of renewable or the amount of new infrastructure that we can build. But we'll need to build some infrastructure to get us there. And what we're actually here today is to talk about, or this evening, is to talk about 4 approaches that we actually have for delivering that 70%. And there are 4 very distinctive approaches, because we brought the 4 out so that we can have the discussion in society, so that we can actually have the proper debates around this. And the 4 approaches that we looked at, and I'll go into these in a bit more detail in the coming slides, is the first is the generation led, where we put clean electricity close to where power is most used. The second approach is the developer-led. In the developer-led, the developer decides where to locate the clean electricity generation, and then we reactively build a transmission system to those locations. Third approach is what we call technology-led, and this is looking at new ways to move clean electricity around the country. And in the fourth is what we call demand-led. And the demand-led aligns with the government regionalisation policy. And this put large energy users closer to sources of clean electricity generation. And what we actually see is that we're consulting at this point. We're doing a 14-week consultation, and we're about 2 months into that at this point. And what we see is that by the time we get to the autumn timeframe, we want to actually have a final roadmap that we can all actually get behind, and then start moving into delivery timeframe to hit the 2030 timeframe, which is just under 9 years away. And what we expect is that the final approach will be a blend of these approaches. So we don't expect that any one of these will be the final option, but we expect it to be a blend of all 4 options. But we can't do this on our own. EirGrid has just one seat at the table to meet the 70% targets that the government has set down for us. And we know that to achieve this, we need to actually have a very flexible, innovative approach to how we actually develop the electricity sector, apologies. And we know that no matter what approach that we actually have, we need to actually have public consent for doing it. And therefore, this consultation is really engaging with as many of the people in the communities that we possibly can to have that engagement. So if I may just go into a little bit more detail around the 4 approaches. So the first approach, the generation-led approach, as I said, is putting clean electricity generation close to where most of the power is used. And if you can see the small map of Ireland on the slides ahead of you, in front of you, you can see that we're locating a lot of, in this situation here, most of, or a lot of the renewable energy is coming from the offshore area. And we're seeing that roughly 4.5 gigawatts of offshore, and then about 1 gigawatt of solar energy and inland wind farms will make up what we actually need in Ireland. And that actually drives the need for 38 transmission projects to be built across the country. The majority of those new circuits and new work that we'll actually do is location in the Dublin region, where we see a lot of the demand growing. And we see, as I said earlier, about 50% increase in demand out to 2030, with some reinforcements, new reinforcements happening down around the Wexford-Waterford border. And in this situation here, we're locating the generation close to the clean renewable generation close to the large demand sources. The second approach is the developer-led approach. And here we actually assumed that there was more onshore than offshore progressing. So we looked at 4 gigawatts of onshore wind farms being developed. We looked at 2 gigawatts of solar and 2 gigawatts of offshore wind. So we assumed that the offshore was going to progress at a slower pace. And in here, again, if you look at the small map of Ireland, you can actually see significant reinforcements being required over around the west into the Midlands, and in also in and around the Dublin region, and in more reinforcements required around from Wexford probably over to the Cork region, and then finally some more up around the Donegal region. In that scenario, we're seeing about 77 projects, costing about 1.9 billion in overall cost associated with it. Here, we actually see that it's very unlikely that this will succeed. We see the real challenges about building the infrastructure and getting the public acceptance that we would need to build what we actually need in the timeframes that we're actually looking at to meet the targets that we're actually looking at. The third technology, so we then said, well, if we can't get this, if we had the same generation mix of 4 gigawatts of onshore wind, 2 gigawatts of solar, and 2 gigawatts of offshore wind, could we make it work? And we started looking at technology-led approaches. And what I mean by technology-led is that, again, looking at the small map on the graph, you can see that in essence, we're talking about building 2 HVDC links, which hoover up the power in the northwest and moving that down to the Dublin region. And then also having another HVDC link on the west of Ireland, connecting down to Moneypoint and utilizing the 400 kV network out of Moneypoint to give us that demand, or to give us that connection back up to the large load center in Dublin. Again, what we see here is that, and we also, the other item that we're looking at is we're also looking at using other new smart technologies onto the grid to help the flow of power on the power system. And here the key challenges that we see with this solution is that the integration of HVDC, high voltage direct current cables onto the transmission system is very challenging, and the time frame for building them can be quite long in relation to it. So the time frame of 2030 is challenging, but we believe it is deliverable in the time frame that we're actually looking at. And also the reliability of HVDC cables isn't as strong as some of the AC circuits. When we look at the final approach, which we looked at, was demand-led. So then we looked at, well, okay, if we assume again that there's 4 gigawatts of onshore wind, 2 gigawatts of solar, and 2 gigawatts of offshore wind, could we move the demand, which is particularly in the Dublin region, out to the regions? So we looked at moving 100 megawatts to Letterkenny, to Sligo, to Galway, to Limerick, to Cork, and to Waterford. So we moved 600 megawatts out of the greater Dublin region. And that's large energy users being located outside of the greater Dublin region. What we actually found is that has a significant reduction in the number of projects. So we reduced it down to 41 projects. And it actually had a significant reduction in the overall cost onto the transmission grid that we need to actually build. And it also aligns with the government's policy on regionalisation. But to make this actually happen, we need to make sure that the government policies would determine the best location of where that large scale energy users can actually be moved. And when we talk about those locations, they are the locations that we studied, but other locations could actually be looked at. So the likes of the Midlands and others could actually be looked at in relation to how we co-locate that demand in those regions. And it was just to allow us to have those considerations around what we're actually doing. And again, for this to be successful, does depend on the large energy users moving outside the greater Dublin region. So when we looked at the different approaches for doing when we compared the different approaches for achieving the 70% by 2030, we looked at a number of different scenarios on top of our normal scenarios on deliverability, on public acceptance, on the cost elements. And what we actually looked at here was a number of different additional criteria. And what I would say is blue is good and red is not so good. And one of the key things that we're looking was making sure that we were hitting the 70% of our electricity coming from renewable sources by 2030 was one of our key criteria. And as you can see from the graphic in front of you, item generator-led and demand-led are blue, which are positive or very highly positive that we would achieve those targets. The developer-led would be very unlikely that we will hit the 70% of our clean electricity coming from renewable sources if we continue with the developer-led. The developer-led was really successful in getting us to the 40% target. But moving forward, we believe it won't get us there. And the technology-led is negative because we just think that the challenges around getting all the acceptance is going to be difficult. In essence, when we look across the various different color codes here, that the generation-led looks to be the most positive, followed by the demand-led, followed by the technology, and then the developer-led would be the most challenging to do. But we're open to discussion around any one of those options as we move forward. The network is only one of the things we're actually looking at. We're also looking at how the market should evolve. And that's making sure that the right investment signals remain in the market for people to invest in it so that we actually have a secure system into the future, but also that the cost of electricity remains affordable, because we need to make sure that Ireland remains a very sound economic and investment for foreign investment and for our own businesses to remain and to grow within Ireland. We also look at how we operate the power system. So we're actually now looking at also as part of this, how we would change how we operate the power system to maximize our current grid so that we minimize future bills that we actually need in the system. But we can't do this on our own. And like, we want to hear the voices of all the stakeholders. And that's the reason why we're doing a 14-week consultation on shaping our electricity future. And it's really thanks to Irish Rural Link and others for holding workshops like this that really help us to be able to engage with communities across Ireland. And I'd like to thank Seamus again for helping us through that. We're also working with Chambers Ireland to host workshops for businesses across Ireland as well. And we have had a number of those over the last few weeks, and there's a number scheduled as well. We had a great session last week with the National Youth Council, and it's really getting the voices of the future generations into how we actually plan the power system. And we got some great insights in relation to what we should be doing, and we should be doing more in relation to pushing the boundaries and making sure that we are developing the power system for future generations. And the National Youth Council were very good in helping that with the Youth Assembly last week. We're also hosting we also hosted about 2 weeks ago now an industry forum where we actually had about 300 participants from the industry, from generation companies to supply companies to large energy users, and giving their feedback on from their perspective around it. And then we're hosting a civic society forum, and it's making sure that we're getting to all the various different parts of the society and that everybody's voice is actually being heard. And we will be hosting a public forum like the government's citizen assembly to make sure that we actually have the right decision at the end of all of this in relation to what we're actually doing. So in relation to your own specific area for the Midlands, like, we actually have the Laois Kilkenny reinforcement projects ongoing at the moment, which is reinforcing the Laois Kilkenny areas so that the business communities can continue to grow in and around that. We also actually have a number of onshore wind projects, which we know are developing in the region. And also we're working very closely with the Just Transition, making sure that as we develop the power system for future generations, that it's very considerate of how the Midlands need to actually evolve in relation to the future changes that are actually required. And the key is that we want to hear your views, and we have a portal which is available for people to give in their specific views and their specific comments. And we're also very much aware that not everybody might be as tech savvy, and therefore we're very much trying to make sure we're using every media to try and get the message out there. So if people want to actually send in messages through post, the address is also actually on the slide here, and we will make this available also afterwards. We're looking for the consultation to conclude on the 14th of June. So we have just over a month left in relation to the consultation for opportunity for people to get their comments actually in. On that note, Seamus, I'll just hand back to yourself, and thank you again.
Thank you very much, Liam, and thank you for that really comprehensive presentation. I can say in reaching out to organize these events, we've reached out to the public participation networks. In this case, we're thankful to Offaly, Westmeath, Laois, Kildare and Roscommon volunteer networks. We've reached out to the GA County chairs and IFA, as well as publishing it in the Westmeath Offaly Independent, the Leinster Times, Midland Radio 3, Roscommon People, Leinster Times and all the Midland public representatives. So we really are trying to get the message out there that Liam's last slide, which was please get your submissions in by June the 14th, because this is a widespread consultation and it's really seeking your views, etc. One of the, I suppose, our favorite speakers in these series, because where he's coming from in terms of community, and Irish Rural Link is a voluntary organization. We're all about making sure and advocating on behalf of communities. As I said, sustainable rural communities with people living in them. So in this light, I introduced to you Bill Kelly, Regional Manager of Community Power. And you really will be interested to hear what he has to say. He focuses on the training and education of community groups in the preparation and presentation of their energy generation projects in the RES auction framework. Building in our success, we provide comprehensive community-focused turnkey engagement in the following: the policy framework, rationales underpinning community projects, community models, legal entities, site location, grid planning, financial funding, bid preparation, contracts, and so on. So Bill Kelly of Community Power really are providing communities a tremendous service. So Bill, if you don't mind, I now hand the screen to you. You're welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Seamus, Paul, and Liam. I will jump straight into the presentation such that we can get to the Q&A quicker. So community power, we have a brief agenda. What is community power? Who are we? We'll go on to talk about the RES, the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. We'll talk about renewable energy communities and the future as we see it unfolding. So community power, we are a community of communities operating in the energy generation, energy advocacy, and energy supply sectors, promoting and protecting the interests of the community energy generation sector. These are 100% community-owned projects in wind, solar, with a little hydro. We have anaerobic digestion and biogas in planning. We are available at communitypower.ie. So we operate in three broad sectors as follows. Numerous energy generation projects, primarily solar and wind. They take the form of limited companies, CLGs, co-ops, and PLCs. And they're selling their power into the national grid. One energy resale company selling its power from the national grid to homes, farms, and businesses across the country, Cork to Donegal and Galway to Dublin. One representative organisation, a not-for-profit, promoting the interests of the community generation sector, and promoting the interests to the public, the government, the Department of Environment, SEAI, CR, the regulator, EirGrid, ISB Network, CEMO, and the EU. The EU are mentioned at the end there, but they're actually quite important in terms of the community RES, and I'll come back to that later on. So our primary projects currently include Templederry Community Wind Farm in Tipperary, operating since 2012. CLAREMORRIS Community Solar Farm in Mayo. It was successful in last year's RES auction. Galway Community Renewables near Tuam, again successful in last year's RES. Then we have Community Renewable Electricity Supply, trading as community power, that sells the power from the grid to homes and businesses around the country. And then the nationwide not-for-profit CLG. So very briefly on Templederry, a community development initiative, and it is where the community power model was conceived and developed. It comprises 2.3 megawatt turbines, 4.6 megs in total, powering the equivalent of just over 3,000 average size Irish homes. It has an annual gross turnover of 1.1 million. We believe every parish in the country should have something similar, be it wind, solar, or a combination of both. CLAREMORRIS, this is where the community power model began to gain traction. It is a collaboration between the CLAREMORRIS community and Mayo County Council. It's a 5 megawatt solar facility on a repurposed former municipal landfill site, and we're reintroducing native flora and fauna there as well, in addition to the solar park. From conception in 2019 to construction stroke production in Q4 2021, we're talking a cycle of 3 years. COVID may push that to Q1 2022. And here we have Mayo County Council congratulating CLAREMORRIS on their success in the RES auction. In this scenario here, Mayo owned, the County Council owned the land bank, or most of it, namely the landfill site, and so they now get an annual lease on that, and the community get the revenue from generating the power. Going on from there, Galway Community Renewables, again successful in RES 1. Community power model gains additional traction. The Tuam Barnaderg community, a 5 megawatt solar facility, and again a 3-year cycle here, although COVID may push it to just over 3 years. And here we have the chairperson of the group showing the stakeholders the site map as they get ready to drive forward in RES. So, as I mentioned earlier, we sell electricity. We offer fair, transparent pricing, 1 month rolling contracts, so people can leave whenever they wish without any exit fees on the domestic side. Annual contracts apply in commercial and industrial sites. The money you spend with us stays in Ireland to help communities to develop their own energy generation projects. We would say to people, to be the change you want to see, support the local circular economy. You can sign up online at communitypower.ie. Also, and I'll touch on this later, another very valuable, vital part of the resale company, it protects the floor price for community generators when their RES contracts expire in 15 to 20 years' time. So you want to be a price shaper rather than a price taker. So who are Community Power? Our personnel and locations. John Fogarty is our MD and Noel Carey is our Finance Director. A lot of people will know John from his work around the country. Both John and Noel are founding members of Community Power and also Temple Derry Community Wind Farm. Greg, myself and Sarah then work on the ground, and the office is in Nina. Building on the success of RES 1, we now have an office in CLAREMORRIS. Some of you will probably know JP Prendergast. JP is the chair of the CLAREMORRIS group, successful in RES, and we expect other offices to develop around the country as we gain additional success in RES. JP, by the way, is also a founder member of Community Power and his group in CLAREMORRIS, and JP is obviously a founder member in the CLAREMORRIS Solar Park. Going on to talk about RES, the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. It is a state initiative to incentivize the production of renewable electricity. It is an auction-based format whereby sealed bids are invited from qualified generators or potential generators for the production of specific quantities of electricity, primarily wind and solar, for a specific time, usually 15 plus years, at a set price. Introduced in 2020 and expected to run in its present format for 4 to 5 years, but beyond that, maybe in a slightly changed format. So the annual auction has 2 sections, the community pot and the developer pot. We are focused exclusively on the community pot. And as you can see here, it is obviously much smaller than the main developer pot. But nevertheless, if it can throw off revenues of over £1 million for individual communities like Temple Derry, then it should be accessible to any and every community around the country. So the community pot, 1% of the overall auction. The maximum project size is 5 megawatts. The minimum size is 0.5 megawatt. And to put that in perspective, the average home consumes 4.2 megs per annum. So you're producing in an hour what a home will consume in a year, or slightly more. So the projects have to be 100% community owned. And we continue to lobby for an increase in the size in the community pot, up from 1%. And we also like to think that as communities gain, as we gain traction around the country, that in time we will be in a position to bid into the developer pot as well, 100% community-owned projects. So this slide here is taken from the Department of Environment and Communications from their roadshow back in January of last year, just before COVID struck, when they were liaising with communities around the country. But it serves to illustrate the department's thinking. They're referring here to the Templederry Community Wind Farm, and they're acknowledging that there's only one in the country back then in January of last year. But they're saying they're putting a policy framework in place whereby we can have multiple community generators around the country. They do not have to be identical to Templederry. Every community is unique, but at least there's a working model in Templederry, and you can adapt from that if communities, if they so wish. So that's Templederry, joined last year by CLAREMORRIS and Galway Community Renewables. Moving on from there then, if your community would like to get involved in the RES scheme, what are the steps? So the first step, you have to identify, you should identify a plot of land in your community or parish, circa 20 acres for a 5 megawatt solar facility, less for wind. Apply for a grid connection assessment. That will cost you 2,000 plus VAT. It's payable to ESB networks. And what it does is it allows you to get in a queue, and it also gives you a cost and a timeline for connecting your preferred site to the network. To do that, you will need written approval from the landowner to have their land assessed for grid. And if the community doesn't own the land bank, you will need a lease. Ideally, you'd be well advised to have a lease option with the landowner in place. Once you receive your grid offer from networks, you're now in the queue with your fixed price for connection and a timeline. And assuming your grid offer is reasonably priced, you can then proceed. And that means effectively applying for planning permission, applying to enter the RES auction. So to enter the auction, you will need your grid offer, your planning, your land lease, your community cooperative constitution in place in your legal entity, and verified financials. Prepare and submit your bid. And assuming your bid is successful, proceed to contracts and construction of your facility. It's important to bear in mind that community power is available to help any and all communities with any and all of those steps. But the single most important step on that road is the first one, that is getting in the queue to have your land bank assessed for grid connectivity, because you can't really do much until you have that. And you can then, that will dictate, given that it is perhaps the single most expensive item in getting into the auction, you need that financial nailed down before you can proceed. So some ideas on financials. Keep in mind now we're taking just a brief helicopter view, but we would do this, we would have gone through this exercise in detail for the RES 1 projects, and indeed for all the RES 2 projects that we're looking at this year and the following years. So 2 boxes here on your on the left hand side, your expenditure. Again, the single most important figure is a $2,000 there, $2,500 at the top, your grid assessment application. And once you have that figure, once you've gotten the queue and got that figure, you can then populate with a reasonable degree of accuracy all the other expenditures, capital expenditure and recurring annual expenditure. Moving across then to the other side, the green box on the income side, perhaps the single most important figure here is the first one there, which is your auction bid price. And that will determine the potential revenue from the site. And as you can see here, looking at the totals, this makes on paper, makes good commercial sense to proceed with a project like this. And the revenues far exceeding expenditures. Some ideas on funding, shares and funding. Before I go through the detail of this slide, I should point out that getting as far as the RES auction, the department have confirmed that they will be making a funding stream available for communities to get as far as the RES auction. And that should be announced in the next 2 to 3 months. And they're working on that at the moment. So, but this is looking at beyond the res, assuming you're successful now in res, how do you build your facility? So this is one option that we're thinking of using in Limerick. We build cost of over 3.5 million. We're going to issue 2 types of shares, A and B. So just looking down through them there, the A shares, they confer ownership, they have voting rights, 1 per person, they're not transferable, they pay a dividend, they don't pay a coupon, and they're targeted at locals. The B share then, it doesn't convey ownership, it doesn't have a voting right, multiple per person. They don't pay a dividend, but they do pay a fixed coupon over a fixed number of years. And that is your investment vehicle for those people who would like to invest in the solar or wind facility. And they are targeted at both locals and others. And you can see there at the bottom of that slide, or towards the end of it, if you issue 300 A shares and 3,500 B shares, you can raise your funding requirement relatively straightforwardly. In more rural areas where you may have a funding shortfall, you can avail of the Community Power Green Bond, and it's available to underwrite financially sound 100% community-owned energy generation projects. Moving on from there, to give you an idea of timelines, the first, looking at this screen here, you have 4 projects here. Temple Derry back in 2012, it went into production. It was a long time in coming, but of course you didn't have any of the res supports back then. So looking at CLAREMORRIS and Tuam, a 2-year turnaround there, COVID notwithstanding, from conception to production. And Limerick now is one of a number of projects that we're hoping to put into Res 2, and we might actually get it turned around within 12 months. Might. I would say watch this space on that one. So the renewable energy communities then, they are otherwise known as the RECs. It's the generic name for the community-owned company that will submit a bid into the res auction. It must comply with all the rules as laid down by the department. And the question you should be asking yourself, how will your REC be structured? Who owns what and how will it be run? Will it have open, voluntary and inclusive membership, be transparent in operation, 1 member, 1 vote, meet the res requirements and more, have a constitution that protects against mission drift, and appropriate asset locks to protect the community assets. Comparing the renewable, the res scheme and your renewable energy community, there are a number of steps, things to keep in mind. It's important, if we look at step 3 here, to get your grid connection offer from networks, you don't necessarily have to have your legal entity set up, particularly if you, but no, it's handy if you do, but given that how important it is to get in the queue, to get the whole show on the road, keep in mind you don't have to have it set up at the start. So the future as we see it unfolding, in 2012, pre-res Temple Derry on its own. 2020, Temple Derry joined by CLAREMORRIS and Galway. In 2021, in Res 2, we have just over 30 communities. Now, not all of them will make Res 2. Some planning permissions may not be in place on time. So the spillover will go into Res 3, etc. We would say to people, be part of the movement, the alternative economic development model, whereby we enrich our communities economically, socially, and culturally while saving the planet. And to look at that graphically, so 3 of us in 2020, we expect 10 plus in 2021 on foot of the res auction. We expect that to double in res 2, 3, and continuing out res 4, etc. And it's important to keep in mind that access to...
I tried earlier on, I wasn't fucking happy with it now.
Access to of the representative organisation and the energy resale company is optional for every local community generator. Next steps, we would say to people, get in the queue, submit your grid connection assessment application. At 2,500, it is the best feasibility study you will ever commission. We would say sign up with Community Power for your electricity needs, be the change you want to see. And finally here, looking at Ardna Crusha, the Ardna Crusha scheme in the 1920s was transformative for the young state. The Res community pot 100 years later in the 2020s can be transformative for communities across the country. On the basis of Res 1, we're currently at 17% of Ardna Crusha's capacity, and we expect to exceed that later on this year on the back of Res 2. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Bill. And again, I suppose I keep saying your presentation excites huge interest across the country. Many rural communities have in the past done many things for themselves, cooperatives, water schemes, self-help, initiatives to create jobs. And I think you've just given a really good example for communities thinking of taking advantage of the possibility of generating power. So before I go to the breakup, if somebody wants to put their hand up, please do. I have one question, but before, I'm just watching hands in case somebody wants to say something. Yes, Val, did you put your hand up? Val Martin, if you turn on your microphone, please.
No, are we in? Is that it?
That's it. I can hear you, Val.
Yeah, well, it's a question thing for a start, and there's a lot has been said there, and I don't agree with it, but we're not going to that now. One of the main things to remember about all this energy and wind energy is it has never been assessed under the SCA directive as is required. But the question I want to ask is this. I have got the financial accounts of up to 30 Irish commercial wind farms, and in every single case, they're making a loss. Now, I noticed our friend there said that Temple has a turnover of 1.7 million euros in a year. What I'd like to know is what are its profits after expenses? And the reason I ask that is that all Irish wind farms, including Gale Electric, are effectively insolvent. That's the hard fact. John Lang got rid of his wind farms in Tipperary recently. He said he could make no money. How are rural communities going to make it?
Okay, good question, Val. I'll throw that to the panel or whoever wants to take it. Does anybody in the panel want to take that, or can you take that question?
Well, I'd say I'd offer a general comment at this stage, right? Temple and others have fought vigorously over the past number of years to ensure that there was a specific community auction pot put in place in the new RES scheme. And in fairness to the department, they went to Europe and they lobbied for a specific community pot, and they've got that. And that's why I mentioned the EU there in the slides. It is a very valuable source of revenue. And we wouldn't dream of taking any community into the RES auction or assisting them in it unless it was provable in very black and white terms that their project was going to be financially viable. End of story.
Okay. Any other questions? You'll have plenty of time in the breakout sessions to tease out these further. Just one other question that came in to me. Maybe this is for, I don't know who, I'll just throw it to the panel anyway. It basically says, do we need the heavy infrastructure, or can't we do it in smaller scales? Why do we need such a high scale? And that'll be the last question before we go to the breakup. Maybe that's an air-grid question. Why do we need such large scale technology?
So Seamus, a really good question, and like so from an air-grid perspective, you know, we want actually, you know, this is the reason why we're actually out consulting and why we're actually engaging with the communities, is that if local solutions can actually be found, where local optimized solutions can actually be put in place, of course, like we'd support those in relation to it. And if that is like where business and renewable sources can be brought together, it's a more effective and efficient way of doing it. But what we're actually seeing is that demand is growing, and also the appetite for energy is growing. So we're trying to meet the needs of society as general, and therefore that drives the infrastructure that we're proposing. But in essence, where we possibly can, we're looking at maximizing the utilization of the existing grid and operating and refurbishing what we actually have, and in building only what we actually need to meet the demands that are actually there. So part of the solution is the local solution.
Okay, thanks, Liam. There's a lot of talk there about timelines, and I'm watching the timeline for this. So maybe, James, if I hand over to you, you will give us the instructions on the breakout workshops, and then everybody really will have a chance to tease out their concerns. Look, I hope the two groups teased out some more questions, or maybe raised more questions than answers. I don't know, but we might get a flavor of that when we hear back from the moderators. So if I may ask you, Brendan, since it was group one, maybe to feedback. It was an interesting discussion. I was there myself, but maybe you'd give us a sum up.
Yeah, I'll try and be as brief as I can. And yeah, just to say it did generate as much questions as answers. We had about 9 or 10 main points, and I'll summarize as best I can. First one was really that communities, it seemed to be a strong view that communities should be heavily, centered to this. But the concern was raised that with that target in mind, that the community aspects, might be some way compromised because we have those hard and immediate targets to meet. And the point was made, the community benefit program is not particularly empowering. That was made in the group, and also that this EirGrid does need to be a genuine, not the decision maker. That it shouldn't, I guess, be a case that we're here to agree with what EirGrid think. We asked just a technological question, I guess, about the age-old argument of underground versus overground poles, and what we've discovered is it's basically technology that means there isn't more underground poles, and there doesn't seem to be any prospect of changing that. The strong argument was made that wind energy as a solution is not feasible from a technological point of view, and that was made quite strong in the group, and that 70% target might not be feasible, which I suppose compromises the whole future that isn't based on fossil fuels. And also somebody made the point that wind levels are set to drop, and where is that going to lead us? Which led us into a conversation on micro generation and the benefits of solar energy generation, particularly by the agriculture sector, and whether or not that can be feasible. And what fed back to us from EirGrid was really that the scale of that and the scale of anaerobic energy production might not be, it's not going to get us to the 70% conclusion. So that was really it. And we finished on really a question. In New Zealand, it was pointed out that electricity, since it went green, has, electricity bills have gone up fourfold. And there's obviously the fear, which I share, what will it mean for the consumers' bills into the future? And that's an unanswered question at the end of our group. So that was it. If anybody wants to come in, have I missed anything obvious? I hope not. But if I have, now's your chance to shout. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, we'll if people think of something, please come in. To the group 2 moderator, is it you, Louise? Maybe you can, come ahead.
Yeah. So again, we had a very interesting discussion. Just picking up on what Brendan said about the community, but in ours, the point was raised that communities probably need to be redefined now at this stage, seeing as we're all online. And I suppose looking at the farming community, they are a community in themselves, and regardless of where they're based, their geography or location. and farmers have a huge input or a huge role to play in this. And I suppose again, it's down to the microgeneration level. The farmers have a lot of assets there with the roof sheds. That it could be used for solar panels, and that any excess should be allowed. Should be allowed either to sell it back to the grid or else trade it with other farmers. Like some farmers might use more, demand more electricity than others, but it should be made easier for them to trade that electricity. The point was also made that even homes, that they could be able to produce and use their own energy, or use what they produce as well. And those barriers that are in place need to be removed to support this. So the point was made about Money Point as well, that and making that into a hub, it was seen as a good idea. And supporting there was good support for that that idea. The issue of onshore wind farms came up as well, and the problems that communities are facing with that, and people, there's a few people have to suffer for the benefit of a lot of people benefit from the wind farms, but there are the few people that are suffering. And I suppose the impact assessments need to be done, not just on people, but the environment as well, before they go up. Just other points there, like a lot of people had some of the same points, just I suppose in terms of which approaches. Again, the developer-led and technology-led were kind of two of the favourites, and a combination of both, but that I suppose the developer is the farmer or the small business, and it's done at a local level. Again, like the wind energy, again, like that, moving this to offshore is probably more beneficial to communities and to people as well. And I suppose one point that came up just around farmers, I suppose they want to see some payback, or some how it would work, I suppose, to trust it and want to invest in it as well. So another point then as well, the whole contradiction, farmers are, they have a lot of the solutions to the problems we have, but the government there's a lot of contradictions out there, I suppose. Just, we're not allowed, cut peat, turf or harvest peat anymore, but yet we have to bring them in then, imported in then from abroad. And the same with beef as well. We need to reduce our beef production, but yet we're importing it in. I think I've captured everything, but if anyone has any comments, just put them into the chat as well, and we record it.
Hello.
Yeah, please go.
Are you there? Am I on there?
Val, come on. Yeah.
Just to say this, I know I'm controversial and I'm not here to ruin your program. Well, just think of it this way. Farmers are being asked to cut back on emissions, and I have documentation here about getting rid of cattle and all that. I run a mixed beef herd for years and have good cattle and all that. But anyway, we're being told to cut back. Data centers are going to increase, according to the ESB, the demand for electricity by 25%. And some of these data centers are for nothing more than to hold the information about people posting on Facebook and Twitter with their dogs and their wedding anniversaries and all that, including the use of Bitcoin, which is a direct opposition to the classical monetary system over which the government has no control. Bitcoin is one of the heaviest consumers of electricity you can have. So we have a situation where native Irish farmers who keep great regulations and produce good product are being pushed out to make way for data centers. And just I'd ask people to consider that and just think about how profound that is in the history of rural Ireland, where we had, and my ancestors had, for hundreds of years, been put out by landlords, impositions, and everything else to put us out. And all the struggle was to keep our land and to keep our environment. And here we are in 2021 being pushed out by Google and Facebook and a few other people who have no input here whatsoever.
Thank you, Val. That's the comment. And yes, God knows there may be truth in what you say, and no doubt time will bear that out. But meanwhile, is there any other comments in terms of additions to the moderator's views? I mean, I'm going to finish up with a kind of a last question that came across my system, maybe to the panel, or two maybe questions. I suppose we dealt with, you know, and it was dealt in the workshop, the overground, underground cables. Going back to you, Paul, I think there's, in terms of targets, there's a lot have been talked about targets and everything coming from, as it were, this is what I'm getting here, from up high. You know, we have to reach these targets, we have to reach the other targets. Other countries aren't reaching them, and some of the worst polluters are China and all the other countries. This is a question here. Why are we so keen on trying to reach these targets? Maybe I'll start with you, Paul, on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Seamus. That's a really good question, isn't it? You know, and it seems really unfair. But if we look at it on a personal basis, you know, the laptop that I'm working off here today wasn't made in Ireland. The car that I have outside wasn't made in Ireland. They were all manufactured abroad. And when we look at our environmental footprint here in Ireland, we actually have a, you know, it's pretty disturbing, unfortunately. It's pretty disappointing. And it comes back to one of the things I said in the presentation. We have one of the largest greenhouse gas footprints on a per person basis in Europe. That's not a really proud record, and it's actually, you know, when we look at China, because China is a large country, yes, they have a large amounts of absolute emissions, but our lifestyles, our patterns of consumption, our patterns of purchase are just not consistent with a sustainable life element. So it's not just about looking at our neighbor and pointing the finger at them. It's looking at our own lives and taking, I suppose, personal responsibility for our own environmental footprint. And I think that's a bigger deal really than looking to government and looking to international institutions. Just starting with ourselves and looking at the changes we can make. I think that's a good place to start. And in Ireland, you know, when it comes to us as individuals, boy, we're starting from a weak position.
Okay, I'm just reminded I'm going over time and I better shortly sum this up. But if somebody else quickly on that one, Liam, you're...
So very quickly, James, I'm not going to hold people late because I think we've been here for a good 2 hours now to sit. I'm not going to reiterate what Paul said, but there's also an opportunity. If we get it right here, we have a huge potential for being able to export the expertise and the knowledge around the world, that not just, and I'm going to say, the people up in Dublin, it's from all our communities, all the learnings that we actually have here that we can actually export as a really strong thing. And it also helps that Ireland is a green country, and therefore showing those green credentials also helps the tourism and all the other aspects as well. So that's all I'd actually like to add, James.
All right. Listen, thank you. As I know from listening to Liam, he's quite passionate in these things and feels very strongly.
Seamus, can I say a hand up? Sorry, yeah. Seamus, just one hand up. Paul English has hand up for a while.
Sorry, Paul. Come ahead. Yeah. Sorry. Quickly, Paul.
Yeah, just in terms of tourism there, I don't think you get many tours when you come and looking at pylons across the countryside. Wouldn't be too pleasing. The stuff from Airbud there.
Thank you, Paul. That's a bit sobering. So let's be clear. Coming to the end of this, and let me first of all say a few thank yous before I give the final word to either Liam or Michael, whichever. Can I say this? This is a consultation, and people will question that, but it is. As indeed is the wider consultation going on with other organisations, and I know there's plans to talk to the IFA separately, and indeed many others who wish to do so. Equally, there are submission dates, one in particular, June the 14th, to EirGrid, and the address was there on your screen, and it'll be on our website tomorrow as a result of this, as indeed will the slideshows and presentations. I would simply like to thank all of you who came here tonight, who participated. At the end of the day, it's time spent when you might have been doing something more interesting, some were minding children, etc., which is the life we're leading at the moment. Can I say thank you for coming in, and please get your submissions into EirGrid and keep your thoughts flowing through Irish Rural Link as well. We'll certainly feed them back. Can I say this to the speakers and the presentations? Thank you very much to Paul and of course who clearly gave us a good outline of the sort of overview picture. To Liam, of course, you just heard him there, and the EirGrid situation and the realities facing EirGrid as well. And also to Bill Kelly. I mean, Bill is definitely, in my opinion, pioneering and more than that, an alternative way of creating power. And we heard it certainly in the group I was in, and the farming perspective. I think there is real opportunity there as well. So I'd like to thank the three panelists for their contribution. I'll leave the final word to, will I leave it to you, Liam, or Michael, whichever. Liam.
Yeah, Seamus, like, first of all, I'd just like to again thank yourself and the team and James for facilitating today. And this is really important that we do actually have these engagements, and we are genuinely out to try and hear the various different feedback, because we'll get a better solution. And we really want to get your feedback. And I want to personally thank everybody for giving up 2 hours or over 2 hours of an evening where, it looked like a bit sunny for a while. So I really do thank you for your time this evening, and please, if you can take a little bit of extra time and give us the feedback, we really do appreciate it. And again, Seamus, and to the team, thank you very much, and also to everybody here this evening. Thanks a million, folks.
Thank you. Good evening, and have a good night.